This is a fictional story inspired by decades of UFO folklore and witness testimony accounts. All names, dates, locations, and events are invented for dramatic purposes and do not depict real people or real events. In the fall of 1979, a folklorist named Dr. Miriam Ashcroft drove 11 hours across 2 state lines to sit in a stranger's kitchen with a reel-to-reel tape recorder and a single question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. The man across the table was 61 years old. He'd spent the last 3 decades working rail yards in eastern Nevada, and before that, 6 years in the Air Force. His name was Walter Coyle. And for 25 years, Walter Coyle had not said one word about what happened to him in the summer of 1954. That tape sat in a cardboard box in the basement of a defunct AM radio station in Reno for over 3 decades. Nobody knew it was there. The station changed hands 4 times, went silent in 1998, and was gutted for scrap in 2011. A demolition contractor named Ruben Ibarra found the box wedged behind a collapsed ceiling panel, along with station logbooks and a stack of unlabeled reels nobody had touched since the Carter administration. 16 of those reels were interviews Dr. Ashcroft had recorded for a folklore radio segment that never aired. Ranch hands, midwives, a Basque sheepherder talking about ghost lights in the high desert. Ordinary stuff. Local color. The 17th reel was not local color. It was labeled, in pencil, with a single word, Walter. Ibarra didn't think much of it. He gave the box to a friend who collected old radio equipment, and that friend, a man who still, to this day, asks that his name not be used, finally sat down one night in 2012 and played it. He told me later it was the only tape he ever stopped in the middle of, turned off, and didn't touch again for 6 months. Because what Walter Coyle described, in a slow, careful voice, pausing every few sentences like he was still deciding whether to keep going, wasn't a light in the sky. It wasn't a blurry photograph or a strange signal picked up on a shortwave radio. It was something his unit found, half buried in a dry wash outside a stretch of restricted land the maps called Coldwater Ridge. Something that, according to Walter, was not wreckage. It was, in his words, still working on getting itself open. And whatever was inside it, according to a man who had no reason left to lie, sitting in a kitchen at 61 years old with nothing to gain from telling the story, was alive. We are going to sit with this account the way Dr. Ashcroft did that night. Slowly, carefully, because the strangest thing about Walter Coyle's story isn't the craft, and it isn't what he says was inside it. It's the 18 minutes near the end of the tape where his voice drops almost to a whisper, and he says something that Dr. Ashcroft's own notes, found decades later folded inside her personal papers, describe with just 4 words, he would not finish. We'll get to why. But first, we have to go back to the beginning. To a smell in the desert air just before 4 in the morning that 6 young men would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Walter Coyle was 22 years old in July of 1954, a staff sergeant attached to a small logistics detachment stationed near a testing range in eastern Nevada. The kind of posting, he said, where you learn to stop asking what half the equipment on base was actually for. He begins his account not with the object itself, but with the smell. He describes being pulled out of his bunk a little after 3 in the morning, loaded into the back of a truck with 5 other men, and driven out along a service road none of them had used before. No one told them where they were going. No one told them why. You could smell it before you could see anything, he says on the tape. Sharp, almost sweet. Like a struck match, but wrong somehow. Like the ozone smell you get before a storm, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Their sergeant. A career man Walter refers to only as the lieutenant, out of what sounds like old habit rather than secrecy, told the men flatly to keep their mouths shut and their eyes forward. What they found, half embedded in the wall of a dry wash and tilted at what Walter estimates as a steep, almost deliberate angle, was not shaped like the flying discs that would come to dominate the decade's imagination. He's specific about this, almost insistent. It wasn't round. People think round. It was long. More like, you ever see a flattened teardrop? Like a river stone, If a river stone was 30-some feet long and wider at one end than the other, he estimates it at roughly 35 feet in length, perhaps 9 feet at its widest point. The surface, he says, didn't behave like any metal he'd ever handled in 6 years of service. It didn't shine. That's the thing. Under torchlight, everything shines a little, even matte paint. This didn't. It was like looking into a piece of dark glass with something moving very slowly behind it. He pauses here on the tape. A long pause, several seconds of tape hiss. Before he adds something Dr. Ashcroft's notes flag with a small question mark in the margin. I keep wanting to say it was breathing. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it was breathing. I'm saying that's the word my head keeps handing me, 25 years later, and I don't have a better one. Memory reconstructs itself over decades. Walter knew that. He says so, more than once, almost as a warning to himself as much as to Dr. Ashcroft. But what strikes anyone listening to this recording isn't the drama of it. It's the opposite. It's how careful he is, how often he stops to correct himself. No, that's not quite right, more like. Searching for a more honest word instead of a more exciting one. That kind of hesitation is not what fabrication sounds like. Fabricated stories tend to arrive smooth, pre-polished, eager to convince. Walter's account sounds like a man still, after a quarter century, trying to build a bridge between what he saw and the only language he had to describe it. He names 5 other men who were there that night. He will not say their surnames on the tape. When Dr. Ashcroft gently presses him, he says only, "Some of them have families who don't know. That's not mine to give away, not even now." And then, in a voice that had been steady for nearly 10 minutes, Walter Coyle says something that makes Dr. Ashcroft's chair creak on the recording as she leans forward. It had a seam. And Miriam. It was already opening when we got there. The seam, Walter explains, ran along roughly 2/3 of the object's lower half, near what he took to be the tail end. It wasn't a hatch in any way he recognized. No hinge, no handle, nothing his training told him to look for. What made it a seam at all, he says, was texture. The material on either side of it caught the torchlight just slightly differently, the way 2 patches of the same fabric look faintly different after one has been washed 100 more times than the other. And it was moving. Not fast, not violently. Over the next several hours, the gap along that seam widened at what Walter describes as an almost patient pace. Patient enough that at first, none of the 6 men standing in that dry wash were entirely sure it was happening at all. You'd look away for 10 minutes, look back, and think, did that get bigger? And then you'd tell yourself you were imagining it. And then somebody else would say the same thing, and you'd realize you weren't. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first. If the object had simply cracked open from impact, the damage would have happened once, at the moment it struck the earth, and stopped. What Walter is describing, and he repeats this word 3 separate times across the tape, each time with the same quiet emphasis, is something working. It wasn't broken open. It was working itself open, like something on the inside deciding it was time. The lieutenant made the call to hold position rather than force the seam further. Walter says this decision came directly after 2 of the men, he won't say which, reported a strange pressure behind their eyes when they stood within roughly 6 feet of the widening gap. One of them had a brief nosebleed. Walter himself says he felt nothing unusual, and adds, with the dry humor that surfaces a handful of times across the 90-minute tape, that he's never decided whether that makes him lucky or simply unremarkable. By Walter's estimate, roughly 3 hours after the detachment arrived, the gap had widened to somewhere around 1.5 feet. He measured it, he says, against the length of his own forearm, because nobody had thought to bring a tape measure to what they'd been told was a routine debris recovery. The lieutenant ordered 2 men forward with electric torches to illuminate the interior. Walter was posted roughly 15 feet back, off to one side, with what he calls a clear, unobstructed line of sight. And here, for the first time on the tape, his voice changes. Not dramatically. He doesn't raise it, doesn't rush his words. If anything, he gets quieter, slower. Like a man who has spent 25 years deciding, sentence by sentence, exactly how he was going to say what came next. The inside wasn't a mess. That's what got me first. You crash something. You expect wreckage, torn metal, loose panels, wires hanging out. This wasn't that. It was arranged, like it was always supposed to look like that. He describes curved interior walls, smooth and continuous, running along the length of the craft like the inside of a shell. Near the center, the floor dropped away into a shallow, bowl-shaped hollow. And in that hollow, Walter says, there was a substance, translucent, almost like heavy smoked glass, but soft-looking, faintly liquid. And inside that, he says, and the tape hiss is the only sound for nearly 4 full seconds, there were 2 shapes. Not equipment, not containers. I want to be exact about this, because I know exactly what people are going to think I'm about to say, and I'd rather just say the true thing plainly. They were forms, like bodies, but curled. Both of them curled the same way, like something asleep. He doesn't describe faces. He doesn't mention size or skin or any of the imagery that would come to dominate popular imagination over the following decades. When Dr. Ashcroft asks him directly what they looked like, he answers with the same 4 words twice, almost verbatim. Forms, curled, sleeping, maybe. And then, after a pause long enough that a listener might think the tape had simply stopped recording, one of them moved. Not both. One. Walter describes the movement as subtle. A shift, he says, like the small unconscious motion a person makes when they're deep asleep and something in the room disturbs them without waking them fully. The 2 men holding torches stepped back instinctively. The lieutenant called for quiet, but Walter is careful to note that no one had actually been talking. And then the substance surrounding the 2 curled forms changed. It went darker, but somehow clearer too, at the same time, and I know that doesn't make any sense as a sentence. I've had 25 years to find a better way to say it, and I never have. It got darker and clearer together, and the second it did, I had this thought that came into my head whole, like it wasn't even mine to think. I thought, it knows we're here. This is the question Walter Coyle spent the rest of his life not being able to answer, and it's one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. If the craft had struck the earth hard enough to bury itself in a dry wash at that angle, and by every account it had, how were 2 of its occupants apparently still, in some form, viable? Had they survived the crash? Or is it possible the crash itself, catastrophic, as it looked to 6 young men standing in the dark, was something that structure and whatever was inside it were simply built to withstand? Walter doesn't know. And this, more than the craft, more than the shapes, more than the single unmistakable movement he witnessed, is, in my opinion, the most important part of his account. How much he is honest about not knowing. Roughly 40 minutes after the seam reached its widest point, Walter and 2 other men were pulled back from the site and ordered to wait in the trucks. He is specific that the order was not a request. He does not know what happened at the wash in the time after that. He was driven back to base, held in a small medical observation room for 5 days, questioned repeatedly by men whose names and ranks he was never given, and eventually presented with several dense pages of official language he says he didn't fully understand and was told, without room for discussion, to sign. You're 22 years old, you're in the Air Force, and the man sliding the paper across the table isn't someone you say no to, so you sign it. And for 25 years, he didn't say a word. Not to his wife. Not to the brother he lost in 1966. Not to a single man he served alongside after his discharge. Then, in the fall of 1979, for reasons Dr. Ashcroft never wrote down anywhere Walter's family or her own archive has ever revealed, she drove 11 hours to his kitchen table and asked him to talk. Why, then, is a question that has no clean answer. But it's worth noting something Dr. Ashcroft herself observed years later in a private letter, uncovered only recently among her papers. An unusual number of witnesses from unrelated military postings across the American Southwest broke decades of silence in that same narrow window, the mid to late 1970s. Not in the 1950s, when memory would have been sharpest. After Watergate, after Vietnam, after a certain kind of national trust in official explanations had quietly, permanently cracked for a great many Americans. That is not proof of anything, but it is, at the very least, a pattern. And patterns like that are hard to unnotice once you've seen them. Walter's account might have stayed exactly what it was. One man's memory, alone on a reel of tape in a basement. If not for 3 other threads that surface, separately, in Dr. Ashcroft's later research. The first comes from a woman identified in her notes only by the initials RD, who worked as a mess hall cook at a base roughly 90 miles from Coldwater Ridge in the summer of 1954. In a short, handwritten letter obtained decades later through an estate sale, RD describes being pulled from her regular duties for 2 days in early July and reassigned, without explanation, to prepare and deliver meals to a sealed section of the base infirmary she had never been permitted to enter before or since. She doesn't describe seeing anything. She describes a feeling. I set the tray down outside the door like they told me to, and before anyone opened it, I had the strangest sensation. Like something in that room already knew I was standing there. Not that I was being watched, that I was being noticed. There's a difference, and I've never been able to explain it to anyone since. The second thread comes from a young civilian engineer who submitted a written account to a small independent research group in 1981 under a pseudonym he never dropped. He describes being brought in briefly to examine. His word. Recovered materials from a site he was never told the exact location of, and photographing what he called biological specimens preserved in a medium unlike anything in any technical manual I had access to. He submitted his account. The organization filed it. And when that organization's papers were donated to a university archive in the mid-1990s, 6 specific files from that 1981 intake, no others from that same year, in that same box, were found to be missing. Not damaged. Not misfiled. Absent. The third thread is the quietest, and to me, the hardest to shake. It comes from a retired communications specialist who gave an oral history interview in 2003 for a veterans history project that had nothing to do with UFOs, unidentified craft, or anything of the kind. In the middle of a long, ordinary conversation about his career, he mentions, almost as an aside, that in the summer of 1954, while stationed in Nevada, he was ordered to transmit a short-coded message to a recipient whose identity he was never given. He says he remembered the decoded phrase for the rest of his life because it was the only message in 6 years of service he was ordered to send without being told what it meant. Object retained. Condition active, unresolved. Await further instruction. Active. Not destroyed. Not deceased. Active. Once you hear that alongside everything Walter described, the seam still working itself open, the shift in the hollow, the substance going darker and clearer at once, it's difficult to set back down. We do not know what happened to the 2 forms Walter Coyle saw in that hollow. We do not know whether they were, in any sense we'd recognize, alive in the hours or days that followed. We do not know what that sealed infirmary section concluded, or where that information went, or who, if anyone, still holds it. We don't even know, with certainty, what happened to Walter Coyle himself in his final years. Dr. Ashcroft's later notes place his death sometime in the early 1990s, but a record search turned up no death certificate in any of the counties where he was known to have lived. A gap, her notes describe, in her own handwriting, with a single underlined word, odd. There is one more piece of this tape, and it's the piece that friend in Reno, the one who finally sat down and listened to it in 2012, told me he has never been able to fully set down. Near the end of the 90-minute recording, after nearly 80 minutes of steady, careful testimony, Dr. Ashcroft asks Walter one final question. It's a simple one. She asks him what he thinks happened to the 2 forms after he was sent back to the trucks. There's a long silence on the tape, long enough that you can hear the room, a clock somewhere, the faint hum of a refrigerator. And then Walter Coyle says something that doesn't finish. Dr. Ashcroft's own handwritten notes, found among her papers years later, recorded exactly as it appears on the reel. I think about that hollow every night. I don't have anything else to think about. And I think, if it survived a crash like that, if it was still working on getting itself open on its own, still, I don't know that we would have been able to stop it from. And there the sentence simply stops. Not because the tape ran out. There are several more minutes of recording after it. The sound of a chair, footsteps, a door. Whatever Walter was about to say, he chose, in that moment, not to say it. Dr. Ashcroft never published anything about that night. She was an anthropologist by training, specializing in trade patterns of the pre-industrial Southwest. Nothing in her professional life before or after suggests any interest in this subject. There is no correspondence in her archived papers that mentions Walter Coyle, Coldwater Ridge, or the summer of 1954, anywhere except that single reel and the handful of private notes found folded inside her personal effects. A 90-minute conversation between two people, recorded on a Tuesday night in a kitchen in 1979, sealed inside a cardboard box, forgotten inside a radio station for over 3 decades, and then silence again. What does it mean when a piece of knowledge doesn't get disproven, doesn't get debunked, doesn't get explained away? It just disappears. When the files go missing and the death certificate can't be found and the man who saw it stops his own sentence in the middle and never finishes it? I keep coming back to the phrase Walter used twice on that tape. Darker, but clearer at the same time. He knew it didn't make sense as a sentence. He said it anyway, because it was the only way he had of being honest about what he saw. There is something about that kind of admission. A man not reaching for the more exciting word, but for the more accurate one. That is harder to dismiss than any story with all its rough edges sanded smooth. Walter Coyle didn't have a theory. He had an experience, and 25 years to try to build language sturdy enough to hold it. And even then, at the very end, the language wasn't quite enough to finish the sentence. Maybe that's the real story here. Not what was curled inside that hollow in the desert, but the possibility that some experiences simply arrive ahead of the words we have for them. That some of what we call unexplained isn't a gap waiting for future knowledge to fill. It's an edge. Somewhere, in a hollow no one has opened since that July night, or in a file no one still living has read, the question Walter Coyle could never finish asking is still sitting exactly where he left it. Condition, active, unresolved. Is it still unresolved? Or does someone, somewhere, already know how that sentence ends, and has known it quietly for 70 years? This has been a work of fiction, inspired by decades of UFO folklore. No real person, tape, or event depicted here is factual.